Good evening and welcome again to another session of History Hunters, brought to you in part by Grandstaff Henkin Funeral Home. If you've been following these programs in recent months, we've been on an extended walk through Wabash, hitting some of the landmark buildings in town, some of the sites where various events took place, and tonight we'll still be in the West End of Wabash, and that's what it was called years ago. We had the West End and the East End, we had the South Side, and you know, nobody came up with a name like that for the North Side. So we're in the West End and continuing our walk through that part of Wabash. And we'll start this evening with the Women's Clubhouse on far West Hill Street. It was a building that was built to replace an orphanage that burned on the south side. There was a large frame building that sat where the South Side Fire Station is today, and that lot went through various transformations. A water cure was there at one time, and then the building was taken over as an orphanage. It burned, and for a time the orphans were housed in an area in City Park in what actually were horse stables when there was a racing track there. But eventually the city built a large brick structure facing Hill Street. We know it today as the Women's Clubhouse, but it originated as an orphanage. And after it served as an orphanage, it became the city's first real hospital. There had been a hospital or two in private homes, one on North Wabash Street, and there is some evidence that there was a hospital in a house on somewhere on Cass Street, on South Cass Street. But the evidence is not very clear on that. The hospital opened in, let's call it the Women's Clubhouse, opened in 1903, and the hospital remained there until September of 1921, 100 years ago this month, when the hospital was built on East Street. That hospital on East Street stood with various remodelings until Parkview erected the city's present hospital out on the 24 bypass. The building that we know as the Women's Clubhouse sat idle then for a number of years. It found partial use as an overflow building for campsites that once existed in City Park. Before the days of recreational vehicles, a surprising number of people camped out of their automobiles. They'd put a tent in the trunk and set it up, and there were campsites in the lower part of City Park. But now and then, particularly in the high season summer months, that area would be filled, and the city would open up the former hospital. You could cram as many people as you wanted to in one bed. They charged $1 a night, and nobody counted the occupants in the bed. But that was a very popular place then through the Depression. More people than you would imagine were traveling out of their automobiles in the Depression. The building then became a part of the Women's Clubhouse Association. And a woman named Jessie Beitman was instrumental in establishing the Women's Clubhouse. And it has grown through the years. It's a very active building today. It's gone through quite a bit of updating and remodeling. But once again, it was the city's first hospital. when it was an orphanage, they established a garden-like area to the north of the building. And there were vegetable gardens there, and there were apple trees and pear trees, and that supplemented the food for the orphanage. Those trees and some of the gardens remained there after it became a hospital, and the produce from that garden, from those gardens, was used in the hospital kitchen. There's a story about one lone pear tree that was there. Somehow it survived after they cut down the rest of the orchard to make a makeshift softball field on the north side of the women's club. And for some reason, a single pear tree existed. The pear tree, as I remember it, sat just outside fair territory on the first base line. And more than one right fielder crashed into that pear tree as he attempted to field a long-driven foul ball. The city, sometime in the 1920s, created a softball field to the north of the old hospital, to the north of the women's club. But it wasn't well maintained, and the plain dealer once described it as simply an overgrown meadow. But then in the late 1920s, a softball craze hit Wabash County. There was one other softball field in town, two others at that time. They converted the old ball diamond on South Carroll Street from a baseball diamond into a softball field. And then where the Beacott Credit Union office stands today, just off South Wabash Street, there was an overgrown, stone-filled field where they did play softball, but it wasn't much of a softball field. Then a man named Thomas Vaughn, who had come here from Chicago with the old Wabash Cabinet Company. Tom Vaughn did a lot of good things for Wabash, and he was interested in softball. He didn't play softball, but he followed the game very closely. And Tom Vaughn gave the city several $100s in about 1928, I believe it was, and the lights were installed at the field, which eventually was named for him. Bleachers were set up, but the pear tree remained. Nobody bothered to cut down that pear tree, and I'm sure the umpires had to work that tree into the ground rules. But Tom Vaughn loved softball, and when the field was rehabbed, it drew in the 1930s, according to the old newspapers, it drew an average of 1,000 fans a night down there. Now, keep in mind that this was before air conditioning, and keep in mind that the Depression was hard upon us at that point. And so people were looking for free entertainment, and they were looking for a way to get out of their homes, their hot, stuffy homes in the pre-air conditioning days. They would occasionally have crowds estimated as high as 4,000 down there. And it was a wonderful, wonderful addition to City Park. To the west of the women's clubhouse, sprawled most of City Park. It had been a fairgrounds at one time, and then the city maintained it as a public park, the largest public park in town. They built a bandstand there that was torn down probably in about 1950. Now, if that bandstand had survived a few more years, people would never have let that been torn down. But the bandstand was used by any number of brass bands that were in this town. And it was the center of activity, as was the city park, every 4th of July. The Lincoln Cabin, which still stands in City Park today, was built at the urging of an attorney named Wiesner, who found a log cabin south of Wabash, had it dismantled and re-erected in City Park. He called it the Lincoln Cabin because it was put up there in 1909, the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth. But as far as we know, Abraham Lincoln was never in this town. There is no connection that we have found that indicates that there's any connection between Wabash and Abraham Lincoln. But Wiesner admired Lincoln, and he said this is the Lincoln Cabin, and it has remained such ever since. There is, by the way, there is circumstantial evidence that Lincoln may have come through here on the train on his way to make a very important speech in New York City before he actually became a candidate for the presidency. We don't know any more than that. Wiesner was also instrumental in building the pavilion, what's the structure known as the pavilion, at the central west end of City Park. That was put up in about 1918, and it once had a wooden stage and dressing rooms, and it was used on many occasions, particularly for a series of programs that ran here for 30-some years known as Chautauqua. Chautauqua programs were prominent across the United States. They were based on package programs sent out by the Chautauqua organization on Lake Chautauqua in western New York State. And it was a summertime affair. In the 1920s and in the few years immediately following World War I, families would often camp at City Park during what was known as Chautauqua Week. They'd put up their tents to the west of the pavilion in an open field. There were programs in the afternoon and evening and occasionally a morning program. And they drew, truly, several thousand people to City Park. William Jennings Bryan was a featured speaker on the Chautauqua circuit, and he was here in Wabash at least 3 times. Once his train was late, very, very late, and his speech was to begin at something like 9 o'clock on a summer evening. The train did not arrive until 12:45 the next morning, but believe it or not, most of the people in the audience stayed to hear him, and Bryan performed. Helen Keller was here. Luther Burbank, a man almost forgotten today in agricultural science, Luther Burbank spoke. The Italian band had the great Catori's Italian band played at least once at the City Park. And the list goes on and on. Other notable speakers and performers came here. By the end of the 1930s, the true Chautauqua programs were over. But community service, run by W.C. Mills, an amazing man, community service established a once-a-week program, Wednesday nights, I believe it was, at City Park. And we called it Chautauqua. Well, it wasn't Chautauqua. It was homegrown talent and movies, things of that nature. One of the Chautauqua programs that I remember as a child, and this was probably in 1943, during the week of the 4th of July, there was a Chautauqua program, and Cecil Mills somehow got hold of a large firecracker. Now, they didn't manufacture fireworks during the war. All that material went to the war effort. But W.C. Mills got his hands on this giant firecracker, and he stood and put it down in the middle of the stage and set it off. And you can imagine the great anticipation of kids who hadn't heard fireworks for 2 or 3 years watching that fuse burn down. Well, City Park, there was activity down on the lower part of City Park. There were tennis courts there. There were, and still is, a pavilion there. People actually fished in Charlie Creek in those years, the creek that runs through the bottom area of the park. And across from where the Little League first had a ball field in Wabash is a natural amphitheater, and that was a baseball field, a regulation baseball field was at that location. Going back to the Chautauqua programs for just a moment, they lasted until about 1952 or 53. Television was known in Wabash by that time, and air conditioning was creeping into several homes, and so there was no longer the need to turn out for programs like the community service Chautauqua programs. People stayed home, they stayed in their air conditioning, they watched television, and Chautauqua went away. One other activity that was prominent in City Park for a number of years was Old Settlers Day. And the museum has archives of some of those old settler meetings. They, again, Mr. Wiesner, the attorney, was prominent in establishing Old Settlers Day. And when they first started in the early 1900s, the participants truly fit the description of old settlers because they were of pioneer stock. They had come here to live in log cabins. They had come here to clear their farmland, and they were old settlers. That tradition went on usually around Labor Day, usually the first week in September. It varied somewhat. And like so many other programs in this town, that eventually faded away. Old Settlers Day is still held in a number of Midwestern communities, even though the old settlers have long since passed away. Up on higher ground in the far western part of the park, where the senior center is today, we had a significant shortage of housing in Wabash after World War II. And the city, attempting to solve this problem for returning veterans who needed housing, they brought in trailers and established a trailer park on the south side of the railroad tracks opposite the old General Tire factory. Remarkably, they did not cut down many of the trees that are there today. I don't know why they did. Well, I'm glad they didn't cut down those trees. But you would have thought that they would have cleared that area in advance of placing the trailers there. Fortunately, they did not. Wiser heads prevailed. And I don't know, probably a dozen and a half, maybe even 2 dozen trailers were scattered in that area. All of them occupied by former servicemen coming back from both the European and Pacific theaters. Some of those trailers came from were government surplus trailers from a place called Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Well, Oak Ridge was, for a long time, a secret part of the super-secret Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb. There were installations in Oak Ridge and in New Mexico and in Hanford, Washington. But Oak Ridge was fairly near at hand here, and Homer T. Showalter, who had been mayor of Wabash, Homer T. Tracked down these trailers at Oak Ridge. I think the city got them for maybe $50 a trailer, and put several of them out there. And all was well and good until the rumor started that those trailers were radioactive. And of course they weren't. But people knew a little bit about Oak Ridge by that time, and when they found out that some were living in trailers that had been in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, some refused to stay there and move out. To the south of the senior center and where that trailer park was, on land that was not a part of City Park, is the Jewish cemetery. And it is one of the older Jewish cemeteries, established in 1854. It's one of the older Jewish cemeteries in the Midwest. There probably has not been a burial there for several years. The Jewish community has all but disappeared from Wabash, but it served the Jewish community well. It is surrounded today, and has been for many, many, many years, by a cast iron fence. And there is, from time to time, a hot debate among local historians as to whether that is the fence that once surrounded the courthouse here, or whether it came from some other source. I think the odds are 50% that it came from the courthouse, although Ware Wimberly, Bill Wimberly, is convinced, as he says in his book called Hannah's Town, he is convinced that that is the fence that was once at the courthouse. But if you walk through that cemetery, and it is open, you can go through there without any problem. You'll find that it's somewhat overgrown. The funds that once supported that cemetery are slipping away, and jurisdiction, as I understand it, rests with a synagogue in Indianapolis. But if you look at the tombstones, it is a veritable listing of the prominent Jewish families that were once in Wabash. The Beitmans, the Svosieps, the Mandelbaums, the Marks, the Hefners, the Oppenheimers, the Wolfs, the Simons, all are buried there. And it is an interesting walk through that cemetery. Let's cross the railroad now. While we're out here, while we're out in the west part of town, let's cross the railroad opposite the senior center, opposite the site of that trailer park. And most of us remember that as the old General Tire site. But it was an industrial site long before General Tire came to town. And prior to its use as an industrial site, it was a fairgrounds. There was a horse track there. There were stables that once were ignited in a fire that swept through there, and it was a spectacular fire, by the way. There was a covered grandstand at the racetrack, at the Oval, and some say that is why Grand Street is named Grand Street. That it ran at one time through the area where the grandstand eventually was built. We didn't have 4-H clubs in those days. We had a Wabash County Agricultural Society. And that, I think, was the second fairgrounds. If my memory is correct, there was a fairgrounds once at the north end of the Big Four Railroad Bridge in what is now Paradise Spring. But the records are meager and few on that. But the fairgrounds were established at what eventually became the General Tire site. And then they were moved from there eventually to what is now City Park. And then briefly in the 1930s, and here we leave the west end of town just for a moment, the County Agricultural Society had what were called colt shows. They didn't call them county fairs because they weren't county fairs, but those were set up in the area between South Miami Street and South Wabash Street, south of Water Street. And not the best area for that kind of show, but it worked for a while. And then the fairgrounds at the County Highway Garage were established. Going back to the General Tire site, that was first occupied by the Wabash Bridge and Iron Works, a company that, just as the title indicates, built bridges. Now, some must have been prefabricated, but they sold bridges all over the Midwest, and occasionally one even as far as the Pacific Northwest. And it was a booming factory in Wabash. It employed lots of people, and I believe this is correct. I hope the bridge that I'm about to talk about still stands, but there is a bridge about a mile east of Pine Village in Indiana, west of Lafayette, that crosses Pine Creek. And that bridge was built by the Wabash Bridge and Iron Works. There's an organization called Bridge Hunters, and on their website, they list that bridge over Pine Creek, east of Pine Village. They list that as probably the last surviving product of the Wabash Bridge and Iron Works. After the Bridge and Iron Works closed, Service Motor Truck occupied that area, put up a couple of different buildings, and we'll cover the Service Motor Truck in a separate program one of these months, because there is more than we could talk a couple hours maybe about the Service Motor Truck. But Service Motor Truck was there, and then Relay Motors occupied that area. There was an agricultural show one time in those buildings after the Relay Motors went out of business. The County Agricultural Society rented those buildings and had, I think, just one summer of shows out there, usually in August or early September. And then, almost by accident, General Tire came to the area. General Tire out of Akron, Ohio, was seeking to expand. And in the late 1930s, one of the members of the board of directors of General Tire from Akron was westbound on US 24, headed toward Logansport to look at available buildings in that town. and he stopped for gasoline. He stopped for gasoline at a station that the building is still there at McCarty and 6th Street. And gas stations had attendants in those days, and the attendant came out to fill the car and wash the windshield and check the oil as they used to. And the man from Akron saw those vacant buildings nearby, and he asked the gas station attendant, "What about those?" And he said, "Well, there's nobody occupies those buildings today." And at least that is the story that is widely quoted, and I think it's an authentic story. And when Service Motor Truck had that property, they built a very, very handsome 3-story office building. We'll talk about that separately too, because the architect for that building, a man from Lafayette, caught on in this town. He designed the what is now the Charlie Creek Inn, at that time the Hotel Indiana. He designed the first hospital on East Street. He designed what is now the County Highway Garage, which was built originally by Motox Tractor Company. And there's another story that will take an hour or more to tell one of these times. So the west end of town has been a part of town that has contributed a great deal of interesting history to this town. And before we close tonight, and before we entirely leave the west end of town, where McCarty Street tees into 6th Street, across from this gas station that I was just talking about, in the late 1930s, a man named Alva Rudisell created what some believe to be Indiana's first drive-in restaurant. It was a very small building, appropriately called the Squeeze-In. You didn't go inside to eat. You sat in your cars, and pretty young girls came out to take your order, and that helped attract the high school boys who had a little bit of money to spend. But Alvy Rudisell had a booming business out there in the summertime, and there's still some people who remember the Squeeze-In. And that probably is a good place to end our evening's walk through the western part of Wabash. We plan to continue these programs on a monthly basis, and we'll wrap up. There's a little bit more I'd like to talk about the West End, and then we'll go out and take a look at interesting properties and buildings on the north side of Wabash, including Service Motor Truck's aviation field that was on North Cass Street. Service Motor Truck assembled airplanes in the days when airplanes in Midwestern skies were still quite a novelty. And as we'll talk about it then, on Sunday afternoons when they would test their airplanes, as many as 6,000 people would line the airfield simply to watch the airplanes. A wonderful story, an interesting story. We hope to see you next month. Thank you very much for your attention.